August 4th, 1962, Los Angeles, Brentwood. The evening air in Los Angeles was warm, but inside the bedroom at 12305 Fifth Helena Drive, the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. The scent of Chanel No. 5 lingered in the air, mixing with the faint bitterness of barbiturates. The bedside lamp cast a dim, golden glow of the woman lying on the bed, Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's brightest star. Her platinum blonde hair spread across the white silk pillow. Her lips, once so vibrant and alluring, were now pale. Her skin, usually glowing under the spotlight, looked eerily still. On the nightstand beside her lay an empty bottle of Nembutal, a powerful sedative. A telephone receiver dangled off the edge, its steady beep, beep, beep the only sound in the silent room. 3:30 a.m. Outside, the city of Los Angeles slept. Inside, Marilyn Monroe was dead. At 3:25 a.m., a nervous voice broke the silence at the local police station. "Please," the woman on the phone pleaded, "Miss Monroe isn't breathing. I think she's gone." The caller was Eunice Murray, Marilyn's housekeeper. Within minutes, squad cars were on their way. By 4 a.m., Marilyn's Brentwood home was surrounded by flashing lights and uniformed officers. Detective James Holliday, a veteran of the LAPD, entered first. He had investigated dozens of overdoses before, but something about this one felt different. There were too many inconsistencies. He glanced around the room, scanning every detail. Red triangle pointed down the bed was too neatly arranged. Red triangle pointed down. There was no water glass near the pills. Red triangle pointed down, no sign of vomiting. A usual reaction to an overdose. Something wasn't right. Holliday turned to Eunice Murray, who stood near the doorway, wringing her hands. "What time did you find her?" he asked. Murray hesitated. "Around midnight," she said, her voice uncertain. "Or maybe later." 2 a.m. Holliday narrowed his eyes. "But you called the police at 3:25 a.m. Why the delay?" Murray's face paled. I was in shock," she stammered. But the detective had seen too many crime scenes to believe her. Something was being covered up. Across the street, Arthur Jacobs, an elderly neighbor, had been awake that night. He later told his son something that would change everything. At 10:30 p.m., he had stepped outside to smoke a cigarette when he noticed a black car parked near Marilyn's house. Two men stepped out. One of them was tall, well-dressed, and furious. Arthur Jacobs recognized him. It was Robert F. Kennedy. "What the hell is the Attorney General doing here?" Jacobs had muttered to himself. Then from inside the house, he heard a woman's voice screaming. It was Marilyn Monroe. Red triangle pointed down a crash. Red triangle pointed down, more shouting. Red triangle pointed down, then silence. 15 minutes later, the black car sped off into the night. The next morning, Jacobs read the newspaper. Marilyn Monroe dead at 36. His hands trembled. He knew what he had seen. And he knew that if he spoke up, he wouldn't live long enough to tell the full story. The telephone on Marilyn's nightstand was off the hook. The last call made from that phone was at 10:30 p.m. The number belonged to Peter Lawford, an actor and member of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack. More importantly, he was Robert Kennedy's brother-in-law. Later, Lawford claimed Marilyn had sounded fine during their conversation, but witnesses at his house that night told a different story. They said Lawford had been pacing the room, sweating, muttering to himself. Jesus Christ, they did it, they actually did it. Did what exactly? The truth was already being buried. By 6 a.m., Marilyn's body had been transported to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. Dr. Thomas Noguchi conducted the autopsy, and immediately he found problems. Red triangle pointed down her stomach was completely empty. If Marilyn had swallowed 40-plus pills, as the official report stated, there should have been traces in her stomach. But there were none. Red triangle pointed down, her internal organs were missing. Noguchi's report noted that sections of her intestines had been removed before the autopsy. Why? February 26, 2025, 1955. Because they contained the truth. Marilyn Monroe had not overdosed on pills. She had been injected with a fatal dose of barbiturates. and someone had made sure no evidence remained. By the time the press was alerted, the official story had been carefully crafted. The headline the world read, "Tragic Starlet Dies of Overdose." Red triangle pointed down no mention of Robert Kennedy. Red triangle pointed down no mention of the missing organs. Red triangle pointed down no mention of the black car scene that night. The truth was being erased in real time. And Hollywood played along. Because they knew powerful people wanted this case closed. In the weeks leading up to her death, Marilyn had grown paranoid. She told friends she was being watched. She feared for her life. And just February 26, 2025, 1956, days before she died, she wrote in her personal diary, "They want me gone, but I won't let them. I know too much." She was right. She didn't know too much. And that's why, on August 4th, 1962, she became the most famous cover-up in American history. Who killed Marilyn Monroe? Red triangle pointed down the Kennedys? Red triangle pointed down the CIA? Red triangle pointed down the Mafia? Or was it all of them working together? Because sometimes when the truth is too dangerous, it disappears. Los Angeles, August 5th, 1962, 3:30 a.m. The streets of Brentwood were quiet. The city of stars was asleep, unaware that one of its brightest lights had just been extinguished. Inside Marilyn Monroe's home, detectives were piecing together a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. Her body had been discovered 3 hours earlier, but nothing about the scene made sense. Detective James Holliday, a man with 20 years of experience in homicide cases, took a deep breath as he observed the crime scene. His gut told him what the official reports wouldn't. This was no suicide. Unbeknownst to the public, Marilyn Monroe was considered a national security threat by the FBI. The Bureau had been keeping a secret file on her for years, tracking her relationships with President John F. Kennedy, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Mafia boss Sam Giancana, communist sympathizers in Hollywood. The file, known as the Marilyn dossier, was locked away in Washington, far from prying eyes. But one man had access to it. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. And Hoover had plans for Marilyn Monroe. Behind the scenes, there was a war between Hoover's FBI and the Kennedy administration. John and Robert Kennedy wanted to dismantle organized crime. Hoover? He wanted to protect his own power. And Marilyn Monroe was caught right in the middle of their battle. She had become a liability, a woman who knew too much, who couldn't be controlled. She had affairs with the most powerful men in the country. She had access to classified information. And worst of all, she had started talking about exposing it. The official autopsy report stated that Marilyn had died of acute barbiturate poisoning. But there were problems with the report. Her body had been moved before the police arrived. There was no glass of water in the room. How did she swallow so many pills? Parts of her stomach and intestines were missing, making it impossible to determine if the drugs were swallowed or injected. Her diary mysteriously disappeared before the police could examine it. Detective Holliday had seen cover-ups before, and this was the biggest cover-up in Hollywood history. A week after Marilyn's death, a handwritten note was delivered to a journalist named Howard Lang. The note had only 6 words. She didn't die. She was erased. There was no signature, no way to trace who sent it. But Lang had a feeling the person who wrote it was already dead. The government called it suicide, but the witnesses disappeared. The autopsy was altered. The FBI file vanished. And the truth was buried. But secrets have a way of coming back. And Marilyn Monroe's ghost still lingers, waiting for justice. Los Angeles, August 12, 1962, 9 p.m. The lights of Hollywood flickered like dying stars as journalist Howard Lang sat at his desk, staring at the note he had received a week earlier. She didn't die. She was erased. The paper smelled faintly of cigarettes and perfume. A woman had written this. But who? And more importantly, how did she know the truth? Lang had been a crime reporter for over 15 years, but he had never encountered anything like the Marilyn Monroe case. He had seen cover-ups, blackmail, and murder disguised as accidents. But this was bigger than the Mafia, bigger than Hollywood, bigger than anything he had ever investigated, because if the note was telling the truth, then Marilyn Monroe wasn't just dead. She had been silenced. Lang had a source inside the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. His name was Dr. Charles Hudson, and he had examined Marilyn's body the morning after she was found. They met in a diner on Sunset Boulevard, away from prying eyes. Hudson was nervous. He kept looking over his shoulder as if someone might be watching. Then, in a low voice, he dropped a bombshell. They tampered with the autopsy report. Lang's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "What do you mean?" Hudson exhaled, glancing at the door before leaning in closer. "When we received Marilyn's body, there was something off. Her stomach was completely empty." Lang frowned. "Empty?" Hudson nodded. She supposedly overdosed on pills. But if she swallowed that many barbiturates, her stomach should have contained at least some residue. Instead, nothing. Lang's heart started pounding. "So, how did the drugs get into her system?" Hudson's voice dropped to a whisper. "There were needle marks." Lang froze. "On her arms." Hudson shook his head. "No, in a place no one would think to check." A shiver ran down Lang's spine. They had injected the drugs into her. But that wasn't all. Hudson took a deep breath before saying the words that would change everything. And her diary? It was stolen before the police could see it. Lang's mind raced. Marilyn had kept a personal diary where she wrote down everything. Her relationships, her fears, her secrets. And now it was gone, which meant someone had taken it to erase the truth. Lang started digging deeper. He soon discovered that anyone who had been close to Marilyn in her final days was either missing, dead, or too afraid to talk. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, vanished to Europe, refusing to answer any questions. Her publicist, Patricia Newcomb, admitted to a mental hospital 2 days after Marilyn's death. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, changed her story multiple times, as if someone was coaching her on what to say. And then there was Peter Lawford. The Hollywood actor and brother-in-law to the Kennedys, had been one of the last people to speak to Marilyn. But when Lang tried to interview him, Lawford refused. Instead, he muttered something chilling. "They're still watching. And they'll kill me, too." The Kennedys and the threat that couldn't be ignored. At the center of the conspiracy were two of the most powerful men in America. Red Triangle pointed up President John F. Kennedy. Red Triangle pointed up Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Marilyn had been sleeping with both of them. At first, she had been a plaything, a secret to be hidden away from the public. But then, she started to ask questions. And even worse, she started to demand answers. She wanted to know why the CIA was spying on her. She wanted to know why the Mafia had connections to the White House. She wanted to know what was really going on behind closed doors. And then she did something no mistress was ever supposed to do. She threatened to go public. On August 3rd, 1962, the day before she died, Marilyn reportedly told a close friend, "I'm going to expose everything. The affairs, the secrets, all of it." By August 4th, she was dead. As Lang followed the trail, he stumbled onto something even more disturbing. To former FBI agent Michael Rossi agreed to meet him in secret. Rossi was retired now, but back in 1962, he had been part of a classified operation. Over whiskey and cigarettes, Rossi revealed what really happened that night. A team was sent to Marilyn's house. It was a cleanup job. Lang swallowed. Who ordered it? Rossi hesitated, then whispered, "The Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy." Lang felt his hands shake. "So you're saying he ordered her to be silenced?" Rossi exhaled smoke and nodded. She was a liability. The government couldn't afford a scandal. She had to go. What really happened that night? Red Triangle pointed up 10 p.m. Marilyn calls Peter Lawford in distress. Red Triangle pointed up 10:30 p.m. Robert Kennedy arrives at her house. An argument ensues. Red Triangle pointed up 11 p.m. Witness hears a scream. Red Triangle pointed up 11:30 p.m. Marilyn is unconscious. A team arrives. Red Triangle pointed up 12 a.m. An injection is administered. Red Triangle pointed up 3:25 a.m. Housekeeper finally calls the police. And the rest is history. Lang had uncovered more than he ever expected. He had enough to prove Marilyn Monroe was murdered, but before he could publish his story, he received a phone call. A deep voice on the other end said only 4 words. "Drop the case. Now!" Then the line went dead. Lang knew what it meant. He had gotten too close. To this day, the Marilyn Monroe case remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. The official story? Suicide. The real story? A woman who knew too much. And someone, somewhere, made sure she would never speak again. August 18, 1962, Washington, D.C. The corridors of the FBI headquarters were silent at night. But behind closed doors, the real work never stopped. A young agent, no older than 30, sat at his desk, flipping through a thick, classified file. Stamped in bold red ink across the top was a single word, "Confidential," and below it the title, "The Marilyn Monroe File." Inside were pages of wiretaps, reports, and surveillance notes. The Bureau had been tracking Marilyn for years. Her phone had been tapped. Her home had been watched. Her private meetings had been documented, word for word. And yet, this file wasn't supposed to exist. The official story was simple. Marilyn Monroe had overdosed on sleeping pills. But if that were true, then why had the FBI been erasing evidence? The agent swallowed hard. He had seen enough. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. This was murder. Just 1 week after Marilyn Monroe's death, an order had come down from the highest levels of government: destroy all files related to Monroe. By August 15, 1962, more than 300 pages of documents had disappeared from the FBI's archives. Among the missing reports were transcripts of her phone conversations with John and Robert Kennedy, secret records of her meetings with mob boss Sam Giancana, a classified report detailing her knowledge of CIA operations. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that Marilyn Monroe's secrets died with her. But one copy of the file had survived, and Howard Lang was about to find it. Lang had been warned. Drop the case. Or else. But he had spent years chasing the truth, and he wasn't about to stop now. Through an anonymous source inside the FBI, he had arranged a secret meeting at a hotel in Virginia. His source was late. 30 minutes passed. An hour. Then, finally, a knock on the door. Lang opened it to find a man in a dark suit, his face tense with fear. Without saying a word, the man shoved an envelope into Lang's hands. Inside was a microfilm reel labeled "Monroe Eyes Only." Lang's heart pounded as he threaded the reel into a small projector. The first image flashed on the screen, a surveillance photo of Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy together, taken just 2 days before her death. Then a wiretap transcript appeared. Lang's breath caught as he read the words. July 30th, 1962, phone call between Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy. "Monroe, you can't do this to me, Bobby. You can't just use me and throw me away like this." "Kennedy, listen to me, Marilyn. This conversation never happened. Monroe, I know everything. About you, about Jack, about Cuba. Kennedy, if you talk to press, it will be the last thing you ever do." Lang swallowed hard. Marilyn had been blackmailing the Kennedys. She knew about the CIA's secret war in Cuba. She knew about the Mafia's connection to the White House. She knew about classified nuclear discussions. And now she was dead. Lang exhaled, gripping the edges of the desk. This was a smoking gun. This was proof that Marilyn Monroe had been silenced. The FBI wasn't the only agency keeping tabs on Marilyn Monroe. The CIA had its own interest in the case. According to a declassified memo, Marilyn had met with an unknown CIA operative just days before her death. The agent's report was chilling. August 2nd, 1962. Private meeting at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Monroe was agitated. She spoke of wanting to expose the president. She made references to top-secret information she should not have known. She was warned against making any public statements. Subject was advised to remain silent. But Marilyn didn't listen. The next day, she told her closest friend, "I'm going to hold a press conference. They can't control me." By midnight on August 4th, she was dead. Lang knew that if he published this story, It would bring down the entire U.S. government, the president, the attorney general, the FBI, the CIA. They were all involved, but before he could go public, something happened that he never saw coming. At 2 a.m., there was a knock at his hotel door. Lang hesitated. No one knew he was here. Then a voice spoke from the other side. "Open up, Mr. Lang. We need to talk." Lang's blood ran cold. He reached for his briefcase, where he had hidden the microfilm. The voice grew sharper. "Now, Mr. Lang." His hand trembled as he unlatched the door. And then, the last thing he saw was the barrel of a gun. Howard Lang's mysterious disappearance. The next morning, Howard Lang was gone. His hotel room was empty. His notes were missing. His film reel? Never found. Authorities ruled it a suicide, just like Marilyn Monroe. The official story remains the same. Marilyn Monroe overdosed on sleeping pills. There was no foul play. The case is closed. But the evidence tells a different story. A story of powerful men with dark secrets. A story of a woman who knew too much. A story of the greatest cover-up in Hollywood history. But was Marilyn's story truly buried? Years later, a hidden copy of the Monroe Files surfaced. In it, a final, chilling note was found. A handwritten page, believed to be from Marilyn's missing diary. "They are trying to silence me, but the truth will come out. It always does." She was right, and now, decades later, the truth is finally being revealed. August 4th, 1962, 10:30 p.m., Brentwood, Los Angeles. The night was still, the California heat settling over the city like an oppressive blanket. Inside Marilyn Monroe's house on Fifth Helena Drive, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. She stood barefoot in her bedroom, a silk robe hanging loosely off her shoulders. Her iconic platinum blonde hair was slightly disheveled, her red lips trembling. Opposite her, standing near the door, was a man she had once adored, Robert F. Kennedy. His usually polished demeanor was gone. His face was red, his hands clenched into fists. He had been drinking, and his patience had run out. "You don't understand what you're doing," he spat, his voice sharp. Marilyn took a shaky breath. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she shot back. "I understand that you and your brother have been using me like a goddamn doll. A dirty little secret." She stepped forward, her voice rising. "I know about the CIA, Bobby. I know about Cuba. I know about the Mafia. And I know that you're all in bed together." Kennedy's face darkened. "You think you can blackmail the most powerful men in the country?" Marilyn's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I don't think, Bobby. I know. And tomorrow, the whole world will know too." Kennedy exhaled sharply. He glanced over his shoulder toward the hallway. Then he did something Marilyn did not expect. He signaled, and two men stepped inside, men in dark suits, men Marilyn had never seen before. A chill ran through her spine. "This is for your own good, Marilyn," Kennedy muttered, his voice eerily calm now. "We can't let you do this." The last thing she saw was a pair of hands reaching for her. Then darkness. August 5th, 1962, 3:25 a.m. Hours later, the world was told a neatly packaged version of events. Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her bedroom. Cause of death: acute barbiturate overdose. Manner of death: probable suicide. The press swallowed the story whole. The public mourned, but they did not question. It was easier to believe that Hollywood's most tragic starlet had simply faded away. But behind closed doors, the cover-up was already in motion. The real timeline of that night. Red Circle, 10:30 p.m. Robert Kennedy arrives at Marilyn's house. They argue. He is heard shouting. Red Circle, 11 p.m. A neighbor hears a loud crash inside Marilyn's house. Red Circle, 11:30 p.m. A call is made to Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist. He arrives quickly. Red Circle, 12 a.m. Marilyn is unconscious but still breathing. Red Circle, 12:15 a.m. Dr. Greenson administers an injection, possibly an attempt to revive her. But was it a life-saving attempt or a lethal dose? Red Circle, 1 a.m. Two unknown men leave the house. Robert Kennedy is gone. Red Circle, 3:25 a.m. The housekeeper finally calls the police. Read Circle 4:30 a.m. high-ranking LAPD officials arrive before detectives, issuing immediate orders to keep this quiet. Someone had made sure Marilyn Monroe would never wake up, and someone had cleaned up the mess before the police arrived. The witness who was never heard. One person saw everything that night. Lawford, Peter Lawford, Hollywood actor, friend of Sinatra, and most importantly, brother-in-law to the Kennedys. He had spoken to Marilyn hours before she died, and when questioned, he told police. She sounded fine. A little emotional, maybe, but fine. Lie. Decades later, Lawford's wife revealed the truth. Peter had come home shaking that night. He knew what had happened. He knew Marilyn hadn't just overdosed. He knew Robert Kennedy had been there, but he had been ordered to keep his mouth shut. And so he did, until his dying breath. When the official autopsy report was released, the public was told Marilyn had overdosed by swallowing pills. But there was one massive problem. Magnifying glass still to the left, there were no pills in her stomach. Magnifying glass still to the left, no traces in her esophagus. Magnifying glass still to the left, no water or glass in the room, which meant she hadn't swallowed them. Someone had injected them, and that someone was still out there. One crucial detail was buried deep in police records on August 5th at exactly 4:45 a.m., just 1 hour after Marilyn's body was discovered. A call was placed from the White House. The message was brief. Has everything been taken care of? The voice on the other end was never identified. But one thing was clear. The highest levels of power were involved. After Marilyn's death, Robert Kennedy denied everything. He denied being in Los Angeles that night. He denied seeing Marilyn Monroe that week. He denied any involvement. But witnesses placed him at her house. FBI records showed his travel logs had been altered. And years later, CIA documents revealed that he had called Hoover at the FBI the morning after her death. Why would the Attorney General be calling the FBI about a Hollywood actress's suicide? Because he was calling about a suicide. He was calling about a cover-up. In 1975, a retired FBI agent, one of the men assigned to Marilyn Monroe's case, spoke in a confidential interview. His words were chilling. The truth is, she was murdered. We all knew it, but the order came from above. And once you get an order from above, you don't ask questions. The interviewer pressed for more. Who gave the order? The agent took a deep breath. Then he said 2 words. The Kennedys. Was Marilyn Monroe's death an assassination? The pieces fit too perfectly. A powerful woman who knew too much. A powerful family who couldn't afford a scandal. And a system that knew how to bury the truth. They called it suicide. But the truth? The truth was erased. Or so they thought. Because now, the world is starting to ask again, who really killed Marilyn Monroe? And more importantly, why? August 6, 1962, Washington, D.C. At 6:30 a.m., the halls of the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia were eerily quiet. Inside a private conference room, 4 men sat in silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan. On the polished wooden table lay a single file folder. Stamped across the top was a word not meant for public eyes. Project Sapphire Monroe. The man at the head of the table, a senior intelligence officer, took a deep breath. This situation is contained, he said, his voice cold and controlled. The others nodded, but one man, younger than the rest, shifted uneasily in his chair. She was just an actress, he muttered. Did we really need to? A sharp glance silenced him. This was never about an actress, the senior officer said. This was about national security. The room fell into silence again. No one said what they were all thinking. The CIA had played its role in Marilyn Monroe's death, and they had done it without leaving a trace. Marilyn Monroe was many things. A sex symbol, a star, a troubled woman. But what most people never knew was that she was also an unintentional spy. By the early 1960s, she had become deeply entangled with the most powerful men in America. John F. Kennedy, the president. A love affair she thought was real. Robert F. Kennedy, the attorney general. A relationship that turned into a threat. Sam Giancana, the mafia boss, a dangerous connection to organized crime. She had slept with them. She had listened to them. And worst of all, she had taken notes. Her personal diary contained classified information, Cuban Missile secrets, CIA-backed assassination attempts, government ties to the mafia. She knew things she was never supposed to know. And in the wrong hands, her diary could have started a war. The CIA had been watching Marilyn Monroe for months. They monitored her calls. They tracked her movements. They listened to her conversations. A declassified CIA memo, written just 2 weeks before her death, contained a chilling line. Marilyn Monroe has become a security risk. A permanent solution may be required. A permanent solution. That was intelligence agency code for one thing. Elimination. Marilyn Monroe's death wasn't spontaneous. It was an operation. Red Triangle pointed down step 1. Discredit her. They spread rumors that she was unstable, depressed, and suicidal. If she died, no one would question it. Red Triangle pointed down step 2. Monitor her last days. CIA operatives tracked every move she made, who she met, what she said, her last phone calls. Red Triangle pointed down step 3. Send in the cleaner. A special team was deployed to her Brentwood home on the night of August 4th. Their job? To ensure she never talked. Red Triangle pointed down step 4. Control the narrative. By the time the public learned of her death, the story was already written. Hollywood starlet tragically overdoses. Another lost soul in the city of dreams. Case closed, or so they thought. A month after Marilyn's death, an independent journalist named Jack Cleary tried to access her FBI file. It had vanished. Cleary pressed harder. He filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act. 3 weeks later, he received a letter from the government. There is no existing file on Ms. Monroe. Lie. Years later, declassified documents revealed that Marilyn Monroe's CIA and FBI files had been destroyed. Why? Because they contained evidence that her death was orchestrated, not accidental. One man had been inside Marilyn's house on the night of her death. His name was Dr. Ralph Greenson, her personal psychiatrist. At midnight, he had received a call from Marilyn's housekeeper. When he arrived, Marilyn was still alive, but barely conscious. She was slurring her words. Her breathing was shallow. Then, minutes later, 2 men entered the room. Men he had never seen before. They spoke to Greenson in a quiet, firm voice. This is no longer your concern, doctor. Then they closed the door. What happened next was never recorded. But by 3:30 a.m., Marilyn Monroe was dead. Who gave the kill order? Red Triangle pointed up. Was it the CIA? To prevent her from leaking national secrets? Red Triangle pointed up. Was it Robert Kennedy? To silence the woman who could destroy his career? Red Triangle pointed up. Was it the Mafia? To send a message to the government? Or was it all of them working together? Because sometimes when the truth is too dangerous, it disappears. In 1977, a former CIA operative confessed something shocking. He claimed that Marilyn Monroe's death was part of a classified operation. The interviewer pressed him. Are you saying the CIA killed her? The man's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. I'm saying she was removed. And when the CIA removes someone, they don't come back. For decades, Marilyn Monroe's story has been wrapped in lies and cover-ups. But the facts remain. She knew too much. She was about to speak out. And she died in the most convenient way possible. The government closed the case. Hollywood moved on. But one question still lingers. Did Marilyn Monroe really die that night? Or was she erased by men who feared the power of a single woman? August 5th, 1962, 8:30 a.m. The White House, Washington, D.C. The air in the Oval Office was thick with tension. President John F. Kennedy sat behind his desk, gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. His younger brother, Robert Kennedy, stood across from him, his face pale. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. They had just received the news. Marilyn Monroe was dead. JFK exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Jesus Christ, he muttered under his breath. Bobby didn't respond. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders stiff. The phone on the president's desk buzzed. It was Pierre Salinger, his press secretary. "Mr. President, the media is already on this. We're releasing the statement about her overdose within the hour." JFK's stomach churned. A statement. That was all Marilyn Monroe's life had been reduced to. A single paragraph in the morning news cycle. To the world, Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy were just two icons of American history. But behind closed doors, they had been lovers. It wasn't just rumors. It was a well-kept secret in Washington. Red Triangle pointed up she had visited him at the White House. Red Triangle pointed up she had called him in the middle of the night. Red Triangle pointed up she had whispered things to him that no one else knew. And on May 19th, 1962, at Madison Square Garden, she had done something that terrified everyone in JFK's inner circle. She had sung to him in front of the entire world. "Happy birthday, Mr. President." Her voice was sultry, intimate, and for a moment, the entire nation saw the truth. They saw the way she looked at him. They saw the way he smiled at her. And most of all, they saw the danger. Because Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a woman. She was a loaded gun aimed at the most powerful family in America. And now, 3 months later, she was gone. By 9 a.m., the first newspapers were hitting the stands. Marilyn Monroe dead at 36. JFK's phone rang again. It was Frank Sinatra. The president hesitated, then picked up. The voice on the other end was hoarse and furious. "Jack, what the hell did you do?" JFK clenched his jaw. "Frank, I had nothing to do with this." "Bullshit." There was a pause. Then Sinatra's voice softened. "She loved you, you know, and now she's dead. That's on you." The line went dead. JFK exhaled shakily, staring at the receiver in his hand. For the first time since entering the White House, he felt truly helpless. As the president sat in his office, trying to process the news, another conversation was happening across the country. At the Los Angeles County Coroner's office, a young pathologist named Dr. Thomas Noguchi was conducting Marilyn Monroe's autopsy. And something wasn't right. Problem number 1. Her body had been moved before the police arrived. Problem number 2. There were no signs of pill residue in her stomach. Problem number 3. The toxicology report showed a lethal dose of barbiturates, but no proof that she had taken them herself. And then, the biggest red flag of all, parts of her internal organs were missing. Her stomach, her intestines, gone, removed before the autopsy, as if someone had erased the evidence. Noguchi stared at the body before him. For a long moment, he considered writing the truth in his report. Then he thought about what happened to people who spoke the truth. With a sigh, he picked up his pen, and he wrote what he was told to write. Probable suicide. The lie was official. By 10 a.m., the CIA had already taken control of the situation. Red Triangle pointed down witnesses were silenced. Red Triangle pointed down files were destroyed. Red Triangle pointed down the official story was locked in place. And by the time JFK sat down for lunch, the public had moved on. That was the thing about America. They loved a good tragedy. But they forgot just as quickly. And Marilyn Monroe? She was now just another Hollywood ghost. That night, as the world grieved, a single man sat alone in his study, drinking heavily. His name was John F. Kennedy. And for the first time in years, he cried. Because deep down, he knew the truth. Marilyn Monroe didn't die by accident. She died because she was too close to the fire. And now, her blood was on his hands. For decades, the Kennedy family denied everything. They denied the affair. They denied any involvement in her death. They denied ever seeing her that night. But the witnesses? They saw Robert Kennedy at her house. The phone records? They showed calls between Marilyn and JFK just days before she died. The FBI files? They were classified for 50 years. And when they were finally released, guess what? Half of them were missing. The truth had been erased. Years later, in 1975, a former Secret Service agent gave an anonymous interview. He had been in the White House on the morning of August 5, 1962. He had seen John F. Kennedy's reaction to Marilyn's death, and he had heard something that haunted him for the rest of his life. I walked into the Oval Office. The president was sitting at his desk, holding a newspaper with her face on the front page. He looked up at me, eyes red, and then he said something I'll never forget. The interviewer leaned forward. What did he say? The agent swallowed hard. We should have protected her. The room went silent. But now it's too late. August 5th, 1962, 11 a.m., Los Angeles, California. The sun burned bright over Hollywood, but behind closed doors, shadows moved quickly. Inside a private office at 20th Century Fox Studios, men in dark suits spoke in hushed voices. Their faces were grim. The news of Marilyn Monroe's death had already spread, and now they had one job. Red triangle pointed down, protect the studio. Red triangle pointed down, protect the industry. Red triangle pointed down, bury the scandal before it could spread. Because Marilyn Monroe wasn't just another actress. She was the biggest star in the world. And if the truth about her death came out, Hollywood itself could crumble. Few people knew the ugly truth about Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s. Beneath the glitz and glamour, the studios controlled everything. They owned the movies. They owned the stars. And when necessary, they owned the police. For years, 20th Century Fox had tried to keep Marilyn under control. They had medicated her, manipulated her, blackmailed her. But now, she was a dead woman with dangerous secrets. And that meant damage control had to begin immediately. By noon, Fox executives had gathered in a conference room. The head of the studio, Spiro Skouras, sat at the end of the table. His cigar smoldered in an ashtray. He turned to his chief of publicity. How bad is it? The man shifted uncomfortably. We've kept most of the press under control, but... He hesitated. A few reporters are asking questions. Skouras leaned forward. What kind of questions? They want to know why the coroner's report isn't adding up. Silence. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. Then Skouras made a decision. Bury it, he ordered. Buy off the reporters. Get to the police. Make sure no one digs any deeper. The men nodded. The cover-up had begun. Red triangle pointed down August 6, 1962. The first lie. The first move was to control the autopsy report. Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the coroner assigned to Marilyn's case, was pressured to keep his findings vague. At first, he resisted. Then 2 men from the LAPD visited him. After that, he stopped asking questions. Red triangle pointed down August 7, 1962. The bribery begins. Fox's legal team paid off key journalists to write articles reinforcing the suicide story. Tragic starlet succumbs to depression. Hollywood mourns a lost angel. The price of fame proves too high. But there was one problem. Not everyone was buying it. While major newspapers followed the studio's lead, a handful of independent reporters refused to be silenced. Among them was Dorothy Kilgallen, one of the most respected investigative journalists of the era. She wasn't just a gossip columnist. She had political connections. She had sources in Washington. And most importantly, she had known Marilyn personally. 2 days after Marilyn's death, Kilgallen went on national radio and dropped a bombshell. Something about this case doesn't add up. Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a star. She was connected to powerful men in this country. And now she's dead. I don't believe in coincidences. The broadcast sent shockwaves through Hollywood. And behind the scenes, powerful people were watching Kilgallen very closely. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding Marilyn's death was her missing diary. She had written everything down. Her conversations with JFK. Her secrets about the Mafia. Her knowledge of CIA operations. And just like that, it disappeared. The LAPD claimed they never found it. But years later, a retired detective confessed something shocking. He had seen the diary, and he had seen who took it. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the FBI. It was a Hollywood studio executive. Red triangle pointed up Marilyn knew about the industry's darkest secrets. She had been drugged, controlled, and abused by studio executives for years. Red triangle pointed up she had seen things she wasn't supposed to see. She had attended private parties where women were passed around like merchandise. Red triangle pointed up she was about to expose them all. Before her death, Marilyn had been planning to leave Hollywood for good. She was going to write a book, a tell-all memoir about her life, her affairs, and the men who had used her. But now she was dead, and her book would never be written. By August 10th, 1962, the cover-up was complete. The police had closed the case. The press had been silenced. The world had moved on. And Hollywood? Hollywood had won. Or so they thought. Because one person wasn't done fighting yet. And her name was Dorothy Kilgallen. For 3 years after Marilyn's death, Dorothy Kilgallen refused to let the story die. She continued investigating. She continued asking questions. And in 1965, she made a dangerous claim. I have new evidence that Marilyn Monroe was murdered. I know who did it, and I'm going to prove it. Weeks later, Kilgallen was found dead. The official cause? A drug overdose. Sound familiar? Another convenient suicide. Another woman silenced. Did Marilyn Monroe's death protect the Kennedy family? Did it protect the Mafia? Or did it protect Hollywood itself? One thing is certain. Everyone who tried to expose the truth died mysteriously. And that means the truth was dangerous. Very dangerous. Even decades later, Hollywood refuses to tell the truth about Marilyn Monroe. They turned her life into a tragic fairy tale. They made her into a myth. Because myths can't talk. Myths can't fight back. Myths don't reveal secrets. But the truth never dies. And one day, it will finally come out. June 5th, 1968, Los Angeles, California. Ambassador Hotel, 12:15 a.m. The ballroom was packed. Smoke filled the air, mixing with the scent of champagne and sweat. The crowd cheered as Robert F. Kennedy stepped onto the stage, smiling, basking in the victory of his California primary win. The senator had just secured a major step toward the presidency. But as he turned to leave, moving to the kitchen pantry, a gun was raised. Pistol 3 shots rang out. Pistol chaos exploded. Pistol Robert F. Kennedy fell to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. In the frenzy, a man was tackled to the ground. Sirhan Sirhan, the supposed assassin. The world believed it was a political murder, another Kennedy tragedy. But behind the scenes, another theory emerged. RFK wasn't just assassinated for his politics. He was killed to silence him about Marilyn Monroe. By 1968, Robert F. Kennedy's conscience was cracking. For years, he had denied being at Marilyn Monroe's house the night she died. For years, he had told the world that her death was a tragic accident. But behind closed doors, he wasn't so sure anymore. He had been in Los Angeles on August 4th, 1962. He had been seen entering Marilyn's house. He had argued with her just hours before she died. And now, 6 years later, he was ready to talk. According to his close friend Frank Mankiewicz, RFK had been privately discussing Monroe's death in the weeks leading up to his assassination. He had confided in select people that he was carrying a dark burden. Something happened that night. Something I can't live with anymore. RFK had been there. He had witnessed something, and he had been involved in a cover-up so massive it had haunted him for years. Some believe that if RFK had won the presidency in 1968, he would have finally confessed. He would have cleared his conscience. He would have exposed the truth about Marilyn Monroe's death. But he never got the chance. He was assassinated before he could talk. Was RFK eliminated for what he knew? Red Triangle pointed up official story. Sirhan Sirhan, a lone gunman, shot RFK for political reasons. Red Triangle pointed up alternative theory. RFK was killed by the same forces that silenced Marilyn Monroe. Think about it. Red Triangle pointed down JFK and Marilyn were connected. Red Triangle pointed down Marilyn and RFK were connected. Red Triangle pointed down both brothers were assassinated. Was RFK just another piece in a long chain of murders? Was he about to reveal something so damaging that powerful people had to eliminate him before he could? There was one man who had proof that RFK knew the truth about Marilyn's death. His name was E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA officer. Hunt had been deeply involved in covert operations during the 1960s. And before he died in 2007, he recorded a confession The Marilyn Monroe case was never about suicide. It was a government cleanup job. Everyone knew it. RFK knew it. And if he had lived, he would have told the world. Hunt never got the chance to elaborate, because before he could go public, his confession tapes mysteriously disappeared. Another angle? The Mafia. Sam Giancana, one of the most notorious mob bosses in American history, had been deeply connected to the Kennedys. He had helped JFK get elected. He had shared women with both brothers, including Marilyn Monroe. But when the Kennedys turned on the Mafia, launching federal investigations into organized crime, Giancana felt betrayed. And Marilyn? She had witnessed their dealings. She had heard conversations she was never supposed to hear. And worst of all, she had threatened to expose them. Red Triangle pointed up August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe dies. Red Triangle pointed up November 22nd, 1963. JFK is assassinated. Red Triangle pointed up June 5th, 1968. RFK is assassinated. Red Triangle pointed up June 19th, 1975. Sam Giancana is murdered before he can testify about the Kennedy Mafia connection. Red Triangle pointed up November 8th, 1975. Dorothy Kilgallen, journalist investigating Marilyn's death, is found dead in her apartment. Too many deaths. Too many connections. Too many coincidences. Years later, a retired FBI agent was asked about Marilyn Monroe's death. His response, "You want the truth? The truth is simple. The truth is ugly. Marilyn Monroe was murdered, and every single person who could prove it is now dead." The room fell silent. And guess what? That's exactly how they wanted it. What happens when the last witness dies? The cover-up worked. For decades, Marilyn Monroe's death remained a mystery. The files were buried. The witnesses were eliminated, and the world moved on. But secrets never stay buried forever. And one final document, the last surviving piece of evidence, was about to resurface, something so explosive it could rewrite history, and it was hiding in plain sight. April 8th, 2013, Langley, Virginia. The air inside the vaulted chamber was cool and sterile. The walls, lined with thick steel, held boxes of classified records that no public eye had ever seen. A historian working for the CIA adjusted his glasses as he scanned the catalog. The files were set for declassification, but one label stopped him cold. Monroe, confidential dossier, restricted access. His pulse quickened. He reached for the folder, hands shaking as he flipped it open. Inside, he found something shocking. Red Triangle pointed down a secret memo dated August 1st, 1962. Red Triangle pointed down a CIA report detailing Monroe's phone calls. Red Triangle pointed down a classified operation involving a containment protocol. And worst of all, Red Triangle pointed down a witness statement that had never been released. A handwritten note at the bottom of the page read, "Ensure she is neutralized. Exposure is unacceptable. Immediate action required." It was signed by someone at the highest level of government, the document that changed everything. Buried for over 50 years, this document was a smoking gun, the proof that Marilyn Monroe's death had been orchestrated. She hadn't overdosed. She hadn't died by accident. She had been eliminated. And now, the truth was finally out, the diary that refused to stay hidden. But that wasn't the only revelation. In 2016, a private collector came forward with something that shook the world, a lost section of Marilyn Monroe's personal diary. It had been missing for decades, presumed destroyed, but it had survived. And in her own handwriting, Marilyn had written the one thing she was never supposed to say. "They told me to stay quiet, but I won't. I know what they're planning. If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." She had known. She had seen it coming, and she had left a message for the future. Now, with everything uncovered, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Red Triangle pointed up the CIA saw Marilyn Monroe as a national security risk. Red Triangle pointed up the FBI monitored her because of her mafia connections. Red Triangle pointed up the Kennedy family feared she would expose their secrets. And on August 4th, 1962, they acted. A team was sent to her house. She was drugged. An injection sealed her fate. And by the morning, she was dead. The greatest cover-up in Hollywood history had been executed flawlessly. For decades, they got away with it. But now, the truth had surfaced. The United States government had spent millions keeping this case buried. They classified files. They eliminated witnesses. They controlled the media. But why? Because if the public had known in 1962 that the government, the mafia, and Hollywood were all in bed together, the entire country would have burned. The Kennedy legacy? Destroyed. The CIA's power? Exposed. The trust in the government? Gone. And so, the official lie remained. But history doesn't forget. And neither does Marilyn. Red Triangle pointed down JFK was assassinated a year later. Red Triangle pointed down RFK was murdered before he could confess. Red Triangle pointed down the FBI's files on Marilyn were burned. Red Triangle pointed down every journalist who got too close, ended up dead. Yet, despite all their efforts, the truth still emerged. Because Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a Hollywood star. She was a woman who knew too much. And in the end, that's what got her killed. An unreleased tape was found in 2021. A recording of Marilyn Monroe's voice, left on her psychiatrist's answer machine just 2 days before her death. Her voice was calm. But the last words she ever recorded sent chills down the spines of those who heard them. I don't belong to them anymore. I'm finally free. And they're afraid. That's why they're watching me. But the truth always comes out in the end. Always. She was right. And now, decades later, the truth is finally here. Fire case closed. But the questions remain. Fire. Who should be held accountable? What else is the government hiding? And most importantly, how many more secrets are waiting to be exposed? Because if they could erase Marilyn Monroe, who else did they erase?